Welcome to the Mercy Cast, where we're learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. I'm your host, Raleigh Sadler. Today I want to talk about something that I really haven't spent much time on. We're all about talking about our vulnerabilities and talking about the adversity that we face. But one of the things that adversity reveals, it reveals the self that we project. It reveals this false self, this self that we want everyone to see because we want to feel successful. We want to be accepted. We want to be loved. But the problem is, and I have said this before, that Christ didn't die necessarily for the false self. He died for the real you. He died for the authentic you. And sometimes when we are following God and we are going through adversity, that false self starts to be stripped away. It starts to crumble. Light starts to shine through. And it's scary. It's horrifying because it's uncertain. We don't know what's on the other end of it. All we know is that we have been projecting something and people have gotten used to it. They accept that and it's safe there. But what I found in my own life is it takes hitting rock bottom a few good times for me to even become self-aware of who I am. And so today we're talking about how to recognize the false self and how to allow it to be stripped away through the hard things that you go through. As a child, Naghmeh would listen to the Iraqi missile strikes in her home country of Iran. She wondered, where could God be in a war like this? Where is God when children and families die? As she got older, she moved to the United States. In time, she would go back to Iran as a missionary, and that's where she met Saeed. Saeed would become her husband, and they would be missionaries. During their ministry, he was imprisoned, and Naghmeh went all over the world advocating for her husband's release. She advocated for him to political leaders, human rights groups, churches, and media outlets globally. But as he was in prison, she realized that she'd been living in her own prison. Today, I am joined by Naghmeh Panahi, the author of I Didn't Survive, Emerging Whole After Deception, Persecution, and Hidden Abuse. Naghmeh, welcome to the Mercy Cast.
Thanks for having me.
And so, as we were talking earlier, I was challenged because I appreciate just how honest and real you are about this idea of the false self, this idea of being able to see the things that we don't want to see, the things that we want to pretend aren't there. During the time when your now ex-husband was in prison, how did this false self become clear to you?
Well, while he was in prison, the false self was building more and more. I was thrown into the spotlight with media, and I was told, or I compared myself to how I'm supposed to look like and what's acceptable in the green rooms, and the celebrity treatment I got, not just with the media, but with going to churches and their green rooms. And so I learned certain things. You say, it's interesting, around the time Saeed was in prison in Iran, it was during President Obama's time where we were making a deal with Iran, and then Trump was being outspoken. So there was this uprising of the conservative world. And I was kind of what image I should have to continue rallying the Christian community in terms of getting my husband out of prison. So a lot of the false self was actually piling on and had already piled on, as I explained in my books. A lot of our false self is created by where we're raised and born and kind of like how our society is. And then being in an abusive marriage where who I was not acceptable, what I said, what I wore, what I liked. And so I had to become a person that basically my abuser accepted, not necessarily loved. I could never get to that level of being accepted. So the false self kept building up until really through Saeed's imprisonment, God was setting me free from abuse and this false self. So I was at this very high peak with media, with churches, with the Christian community. As many would say, there was so much unity around getting Saeed out. And at the very peak is when God just unraveled a lot of things in my life and showed me that I was on a very dangerous road to the celebrity Christian culture, which is not Christianity. And also that he really revealed to me through my journey of advocating for my husband. I was breaking free from the abusive marriage I was in. I didn't realize it, but as I was struggling, it's kind of like a butterfly struggling to get out of a cocoon. As I was struggling to get my husband out of prison, I was discovering my identity in Christ as I was drawing close to God. And speaking at churches and in events, I had to draw closer and closer to God. In that drawing close, there was an explosion where everything just crumbled, and all that remained was my relationship with God. The Christian community judged me and left the moment the abuse of my marriage came out. I was no longer a hero wife. I was no longer a wife. I was no longer a pastor's wife. I was no longer an amazing hero advocate. I was no longer considered even a good Christian. So everything I had relied on that had defined me crumbled. And that's when my journey of discovering who I am, and which a lot of it is based on who God created me to be, my relationship with Christ. And so that's when the journey started, when all of the false selves and the perfect social media image of our family, people still remember seeing me and the Saeed and the kids in front of Disney. That was what a lot of people remembered about, and that image that we portrayed to the world crumbled. And yeah, that's when my journey started, is when everything crumbled.
That's such a powerful statement. That's when my journey started, when everything crumbled. Because oftentimes when we look at moments in our past that were really difficult, we see that as an ending. We see that as failure, like a failure point, like, oh my gosh, I lost everything. But the beauty that we find in redemption, especially in the Christian idea of redemption, is that if we look back at that moment where there was that failure point, or where everything fell apart, where we hit rock bottom, maybe that's not the end as much as it is a new beginning. Maybe the things that God's doing now in our lives, he has set us free through that piece of adversity. He's opened our eyes to what he's doing in our lives, as well as what he's doing in the lives of others, and how we can come alongside him and partner. So you mentioned this idea of being in the green rooms, not only for these newsrooms that you were in, but also in these green rooms in churches, which is such a hilarious picture for me, but I've seen it too. Some churches have these green rooms, and they're trying to be as professional as possible, but there feels like there is this celebrity piece. And I think the water feels good when you get into that, you get accepted into that crew, into that movement. What was it like for you when you decided, I can no longer stay in this marriage, and I need to step away, and I need to separate from that? Because you were making a choice in that moment. And that moment, in a sense, brought a form of death to you. I mean, this is your title. I didn't survive. It in a sense killed you, or at least killed that image. And so what was going through your mind during that time?
Yeah, it is those green rooms are very addicting. I remember being in a green room with John Piper right before I spoke at Liberty. And I was thinking, wow, like this is all the special people go in the green room, and all the special speakers. And
does he talk with his hands? Because when he preaches, he's like, oh, like he just throws his hands in front of him. And I respect it. I really flourished in the Northeast. And so I talk with my hands a lot, and, sometimes I have to sit on them to not look too weird. But does he do that in the green room? Is he like flailing his arms everywhere?
Yeah, we had a good conversation, but the green rooms are addicting because you're like, I remember, and it was not just that it was John Piper. We were about to step into this stage with Liberty University, 30,000 students, whatever, or tens of thousands. I don't know how many they had, but it was like a stadium full of students, and getting a seat at the table was Obama coming to Boise, Idaho to meet and talk about Saeed's imprisonment, or getting a call from Donald Trump, or those things that you feel like, I'm so important. This is such an important thing, or, I'm such an important person. And so they are addicting. They were puffing me up. They were it's like a frog in warm water. You don't realize you're dying, but you are. I was kind of getting used to like, oh, I can have this amazing worship by Christians, and very rich life, and I can have Christ himself as well. I can be a good Christian and be very worldly and have all this nice stuff that my friends have, like Franklin Graham, all the private jets. And I was really kind of buying into that. But the more I drew close to Christ, the more he spoke to me, even before speaking to me about the abuse I'd been under, spoke to me that friendship with the world is being his enemy. And I was at a very comfortable place. I knew I had a really good income by speaking. I kind of knew where I was headed. I was headed in a comfortable lifestyle with homes and cars and, even possibly private jets, kind of where my friends were at. And that's when God was like, he loved me so much. He pulled me out of it. And I literally lost everything. Even the house I'm currently in is the house I was raised in, is my parents' house. And I lost everything, all the income, all the ministry. I was told by, big names, if you keep talking about abuse, you're never going to ever have ministry. We're not going to ever give you a platform. And at that point, I had to decide, do I follow what God has put on my heart, or do I still, it's kind of like the ring in the Lord of the Rings, where you're like,
yeah, my precious. Yeah.
My precious. And God is like, are you willing to get rid of the precious and just like throw it away? And so I was at a very hard crossroad, because honestly, being out of the celebrity Christian world was not even half the battle. For me, the hardest thing was the road that I was about to choose meant drawing boundaries in my marriage and not allowing the abuse. It was, and I'm not downplaying there was physical abuse, which a lot of people, that's not the case in their marriage. And they're wasting away, they're dying because it's just emotional. And they're like, I wish there was something physical where I can show people what's happening to me. But in my marriage, there was definitely physical abuse. There was adultery that Saeed actually ended up confessing to Franklin Graham when he came out of prison, that he had been cheating throughout our marriage. And my hardest crumble was not just being removed from the Christian celebrity world and losing all the income and all the prestige that came with that. The biggest part was probably my biggest idol outside of ministry, marriage, that by drawing boundaries, I could lose that marriage and become a single mom and have the divorce label on my forehead, where it's like the taboo. Pastors are always talking about the divorce rate and, oh no, you don't want to be a part of that. And it's a shame that the divorce rate with Christians is even higher or as bad as the outside world. And so I didn't want to be part of that statistic. But with drawing boundaries, I knew that God did not want me to submit to abuse and corruption. I knew that if I didn't draw boundaries, it was no longer just me being in a very dangerous marriage, and also my kids, how they would be affected by it, but there would be a false perception of who our family was and Saeed, and there would be deception in the body of Christ for the sake of making money. I would have to cover up for the sake of having a good ministry and having a good income and being called a good Christian. And I lost all of that. And I remember the moment I was sitting in my bed crying. I had my wedding ring on. Mm-hmm. And I remember just taking it off and saying, okay, God, I'm going to draw the boundaries. I don't know. I think this is an Isaac moment. If you're going to give it back to me, I would love that, but I'm letting go of all of it. So it was scary. I remember my pastor saying, don't stop talking about the abuse. People are going to throw stones at you. But at that moment, I knew that the truth had to come to light, and whatever the cost of that was, it was what it was. I had to be real and raw and vulnerable before God first, and then the Christian community. And being vulnerable does open you up to a lot of stones and judgment. So,
well, and yesterday I read an article from the Baptist Press in preparation for this interview. And basically, this was an article from that time, and you were quoted as saying, and I'm paraphrasing the quote, but you're basically saying, I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe we stay married, maybe we don't, but there are things that need to be addressed. And I am putting up boundaries, and I want this to be healthy. And if God decides whatever, we will work for that. And I mean, that's such an important thing, because I think as you describe kind of how leaders in Christendom responded to this moment, because I'm sure there were people who were like, don't get a divorce, because if you get a divorce, then that's going to impact how many people hear the gospel, and that's going to impact, the gospel
Cause of Christ, it's
proclamation.
going to damage the cause of Christ, is what I was told.
And that is, on a good day, that's misguided. And on a bad day, that is spiritually abusive, because now you're saying, if you don't do this, if you don't get back together, I mean, I think there's a lot of well-meaning people there. And I remember, or well-meaning people in the world, especially in the church, where, they would say, well, we don't want people to get divorced. And they would encourage people to do anything they can to reconcile. And I think that's important. But when it comes to abuse, I'm seeing the tide turn a little bit, but now people are starting to recognize it's not wise, nor is it helpful to push someone back into a marriage where they are dying slowly, where they are not safe, where they are hurt. Like many of the people that I've worked with over the years in the anti-trafficking space stayed with an abuser because they felt like they had to. And as Christians, as people of faith, we have to allow, I think, a type of nuance in this, to understand that abuse does happen in many marriages, and we need to listen for that rather than just pushing for what looks right or what fits the narrative or what won't damage the cause of Christ. I mean, I'll be really honest with you. The cause of Christ is way stronger. And it's like, I mean, it's not like any of the mistakes that we've made. It's like God's like, or any of the things that have happened, or any of the things that
where God's like, oh no, this is going to come out and it's going to damage my.
He's like, hold on, guys. We got to figure out a plan B. Let's get a big board meeting. Like Father, Son, and Holy Spirit aren't meeting and saying, you know what? This happened. We got to look at optics. We got to figure out our optics right now. What do we do now?
How do you damage control?
Yeah, exactly. But you talk about how you stepped away from all of that because you had it all on a silver platter, and you had to be true to yourself, but you also had to be true to everyone else who was looking at you as an example and say, what you think is reality is not reality. As a matter of fact, reality has been slowly killing me.
Yeah.
I can't live in this false reality that everyone believes. And so that's where your journey started. What were the next steps after you decided, hey, like I'm jettisoning this, after you decided I'm letting this go and I'm walking away?
I do want to say I was so afraid of divorce. I actually didn't file, even though I had grounds. There was physical abuse, but there was adultery. I had kind of grown up in the purity movement, never dated. Saeed was my, so I was the innocent party, and he was definitely the one who, but the moment I drew boundary with abusers and narcissists is the moment he was done with me. And I honestly didn't think he would be done with me. I thought he would fight for our marriage as much as I fought to get him out of one of the worst prisons in the world. So he came out and he's like, I'm done. He filed for divorce. And that was like shocking to me, because I saw like what he'd always said in our marriage, that I was dispensable. I was worthless. Like, you're not worth fighting for. Like, hey, you stood up to me. You dared say something against me. And now where I'm done with you, I'm moving on. And he did. He moved on. He was with different women that he had been throughout our marriage. And he has a child now from a girlfriend. And so he moved on. So I want to say, I wasn't the one that filed. And I do give, I want to say I'm not against filing for divorce, but I was so scared of that. That theology had me I was so afraid of upsetting God that even though I had every right, according even to the Bible, to file for divorce, I didn't.
Right.
And the other thing is, I think a lot of what we talked about before this podcast was your heart for the broken and, the vulnerable. I think that's the heart of the issue of when we decide what we're going to do with a situation that rises up that might end a marriage. Are you going to care more about the person than the institution? That was what God spoke to me through through Sabbath. And I was getting stones thrown at me, even though I was not the one that filed for divorce, but I was still the one being attacked. And God showed me through the teaching of Sabbath was like, Sabbath was important to God. God set it up from, Genesis and all that. But Jesus is like, but there's a person wasting away and you guys are so hard-hearted. And Jesus kept touching that Sabbath thing. Like that was a big deal for the religious leaders. They were cared more about the institution that was set up. And Jesus like, it's about the person. Like you've missed the whole point. If you are so focused on saving an institution, whether it's a marriage or a church, a pastor, I hear this all the time, pastor who is sexually abusing the flock or something. No, you don't want it to come out because it's going to damage the cause of Christ and you're trying to save the church.
Right.
You're trying to save people from stumbling. God is not about hiding sin. He's about that one sheep that's hurting. Let it come out. Let the institution crumble if it has to. But let's go for that one sheep that's being abused by someone who should be protecting him or her, whether it's their pastor or the institution that was set up, whether it's a church or marriage or whatever it is, was so that person would thrive. But, if the person's dying inside of that, what's the point of that institution if it's not honoring God? We're supposed to have institutions set up, whether it's marriage or church or whatever, that shows the world like, wow, one at top is actually a servant. And the person in that institution is thriving. It's flourishing. And a lot of times when people are in abusive situations, whether it's in a marriage or trafficking or church or whatever institution that is supposed to protect them, even if there's not physical abuse, they really feel like they're wasting away. And that's not God's intention for his people. We're supposed to flourish. We're supposed to be called. We're supposed to step into what he's called us to be. And when you're in an abusive situation, you're bound. Jesus came to release us from bondage, not bind us. And so I always, in my own mind, also, I go back to that theology of what is it that's keeping me from helping the person bleeding by the side of the road? What's wrong with my theology that's not letting me touch that person? And I just want to say this, early on, that came up when my country was in an 8-year war with Iraq. Like you mentioned at the beginning, there was missiles and bombs, and I saw people from Iran, my own country, Iran, dying. So when I came to America, I had a passion to reach refugees, but I didn't want to reach the Iraqi refugees.
Oh, yeah,
I didn't want to touch them. And God was like, why? Wait a minute, why? Yeah. And I realized there was bitterness, like I'd seen. And so I think a lot of times when we are not willing to touch someone who's crying out for help, whether it's a foreigner, a refugee, someone that's different than us, we have to really go, what is it in my theology that's wrong? Because the ultimate thing that we're supposed to do as ambassadors for Christ is to show the great love, compassion, mercy, and grace of God. And so I've had to do that a few times where I'm like, why am I not wanting to touch this person? And I had to go back before God and process things in my own heart that still I held a grudge to a certain people group even.
I appreciate how you clarified that Saeed ended the marriage. And even in that, I think the part that is frustrating for me as a believer is that there was still pressure for you to hold it together, even though there were biblical grounds, even though he was filing. And it was as if you were made to be the villain in the story. And I've seen that in a lot of situations where there is abuse, that oftentimes it's the person who's been victimized that's villainized. I see that. I tell churches that all the time as we work with them. I say, the people that, first of all, people who are trafficked, they're often hidden in plain sight right behind your assumptions. And so the people in your community that you think, well, these people, whether it be our immigrant neighbor, whether it be our neighbor experiencing homelessness, whether it be our neighbor who's living with mental health issues, it's these people that it could be very easy for us to look at and see in a negative light. It's those people that are targeted by would-be exploiters.
Yes.
And I think in your story, you have people who are, they're lost in the limelight of the institution. And yes, a good friend of mine, Boz Chavijan, we have this conversation frequently, this idea that oftentimes the institution will always trump the individual. And there are many individuals who are just thrown out in the wake of institutions. And when we are benefiting from said institution, regardless of what the institution is, it's a great place. It's a good place when we're in the good graces of the institution. But the moment that we call something out or recognize something that doesn't fit right. Now we're an enemy of the institution. And
An enemy of Christ. A lot of times I've had people that have come out of church abuse say they were literally called enemies of Christ by the pastor because they were questioning the institution. And yeah.
Yeah, and you did do that. And you even went deeper than the institution. You said, what in my theology is wrong? And that is such a scary place to be, because when you believe something like absolute truth and we believe the claims of Scripture, I believe that actually frees us to look at things and be like, okay, so what is biblically grounded here? And what is culturally grounded? What is
Yes.
just something I'm being told to do that doesn't really go along with Scripture? It's like there's a lot of things that I was taught growing up that weren't biblical at all, but they had this cloak of religiosity. And growing up in a Baptist framework, I was taught probably with this phrase, don't smoke, don't chew, don't run with girls that do. And I was like, that's got to be biblical. There's somewhere that's a poem. It's probably in the Psalms,
Yeah.
There's 150 some Psalms. So it's got to be in there. Maybe I haven't read them all at that point.
Or
So,
proverb.
oh yeah, it's got to be a proverb. King Solomon said that. Right?
Yeah.
But then you start digging in and you're like, that's not there. That's not there at all. And so when you start questioning that in your own life, and then you say, hey, guys, I found something. Well, now you're upsetting the apple cart.
Yes.
Now you're a threat. And so as your journey began, as your old false self starts to crumble, you're sitting there, I would assume, and saying, okay, I've called this out. I'm being treated like a villain by some of the people who were my friends, who I looked up to. And now, and I'm not even the one filing for divorce here. And there's this pressure been put on me to hold everything together. And all the while, I'm just trying to follow Jesus.
But navigate to the best of my ability. Yeah. Yeah. It was hard because it was people that had become my friends. And they said, if you talk about abuse and corruption in your marriage and the church, it's going to damage the cause of Christ, which is not who God is. And I was really trying to be silenced, but I had to let go of that too. Like, you're never ever going to do ministry. And I was like, what's ministry? If I'm not like being honest with Jesus, then what's ministry? I don't want ministry. And so I really had to get to the place. And even today, I get back to it every day. Is God's like, just enjoy being with me today. You don't have to know, 5 years from now, just I've given you enough for today. Even after I wrote my book, I expected this high, and then it was like a crash. It's been a crash of just, maybe it's like finally everything's out and my body's just like kind of going through its own process. But yeah, when everything got stripped from me I got to a good place with Jesus where I knew that those things didn't matter. I didn't need them for survival. I didn't need them for my daily bread, that Jesus himself as my covering, was my provider, was the one who would, if I wasn't really hungry for ministry anyway, it had been an idol in my life that God helped crumble. But I mean, I see even in the last few years, God has given me a ministry. It's different. It's not standing up in these platforms and being applauded. It's with the persecuted church. It's with the broken. It's with the abused. And so that if that's where he wants me, then that's the best place to be at. And Jesus says, when you help the least of these, my brothers, then that's when you've actually really helped me, when you've ministered to me. So everything crumbled. My false self came out. I remember there was a season in 2019, I think God finally had me remove all of my makeup too, because I was told, you're so ugly, your hair. I was coloring my hair because the black hair was considered really ugly by my husband. But I remember like there was a season where God's just like, remove all of it. And I actually share a photo of it in my book. And I start walking around with nothing, no veil, no cover, just like me. And it was really scary, but it was also like, wow, like no one really cares. No one's like going, oh my gosh, she's so ugly. And so there was things that were stripped from me that God would just help me find my identity and my worth and beauty in him. And that's the best thing that happened in my life. Like you said, and we talked about at the beginning, a lot of times what we think is the ending is actually a beginning. It's not necessarily a beginning like everyone else. We think being a successful Christian minister means you have these platforms, you're speaking at these churches, you're friends with these people. It might not be that, but the beginning is when what you think has come to an end, then you're in a beginning with Jesus, and which is more as the authentic, carrying your cross daily and following him.
Well, and as we believe in Jesus, we also believe in this idea of rebirth and this idea of renewal. And renewal requires change. And we don't like change, even though we're a people of change. You can look at the scriptures, and I want to see someone find a character in the Bible that's not in transition, that's not in a place of change. We think that we can get to a point where we've got it all figured out, everything's okay, and we can coast. That's not life. That's not the Bible. The Bible calls us to the ultimate reality of living for God and living for our neighbor. And I think as you're talking about this, I'm really captivated by this idea. You talk about the veil and the cover because you've experienced this both figuratively and literally, right? Like you have grown up in a family in a country where as there was a revolution and there was a shift to wearing the ceremonial covering and to presenting a certain way. And then you come into evangelicalism back in the United States. And then in your ministry, where the cover now is figurative. Like now I'm being tempted to, I've got to look a certain way and I've got to behave a certain way.
Yeah.
And I got to keep up appearances. And as we start dying to that and allowing that to be stripped away, because we don't have to strip it away. Adversity does that for us.
Yes.
And God allows for things to come into our lives that we think are the worst thing in the world at the moment.
I just want to say, when I came to America, I was a Muslim immigrant. A lot of times there's this, I can see even with my Muslim friends, when they have the head covering, people react differently when I walk with someone who has the head covering versus when I don't. I do want to say when I came to America, I was Muslim. I didn't come as a Christian.
And you talk about in your book how you and your brother, as you got to America, you talked to your uncle, and your uncle is basically shares the gospel with your brother. And you'd already been exposed to the gospel through, I believe, a radio program. Talk about the invisible.
Not the gospel. We were exposed to. We heard someone on the radio say God is love. We didn't hear anything about Jesus and that we could pray to God. But when we came to America, yes, my brother had a vision of Jesus. And then we had an uncle who we didn't know was a Christian who told us about Jesus.
And then you're starting to follow Jesus in this moment, and your family, your parents, they react negatively. This was not what they wanted to hear. So they distance you from your uncle. But that fire, it continues to grow. And over time, you're getting opportunities. But then, like we were talking about, that one veil is kind of replaced by another veil. And I feel like as you've gone through life, it seems to be like this constant refrain of, okay, what needs to go so I can be unveiled before Christ?
Yeah, there's so much. What you started saying is so much of our Christianity is not the Bible, is the culture. It's what you said about the poem about not hanging out with girls who chew or whatever.
Yeah, right.
As so much of it, but when we hit adversity and when a lot of the false stuff crumbles, then we kind of freak out a little bit because it was not based on the foundation of Christ. And we kind of go back to that, where which of it was culture, which part of it was my own prejudices, like I did with the Iraqi people, which part of it is, and which part of it is the gospel. And so we talk about all of this because people say, are you about the persecuted church? Because I work in the Middle East with the persecuted church. Or is it about abuse? It's all of it, because the heart of God is when everything else is stripped away. It's really reaching the vulnerable and the people that should be, as people of God, we should be protecting, we should be advocating for. And, the Bible talks about the foreigners because I was a foreigner. I know how they feel. It's really scary and it's really vulnerable. And instead of seeing it as a place of fear, seeing it as a place of like, wow, God has brought these people that I could never reach for the gospel. I could never love and learn from and grow in community with. And so, I think as all of it matters, I know you work with like trafficked women, but all of it, it's really about the vulnerable.
Absolutely.
Really, the
Absolutely.
heart of God is really about the vulnerable, whether it's
100%.
abuse in a marriage, in a church, outside of a church. And we really need to get to the heart of where our theology is not biblical, where we're not being compassionate and we're not helping lift the vulnerable, which in a lot of times, like even with trafficked people, they're being bullied by institutions, by big institutions and structures that make a lot of money off of it, and so it's really rescuing them, and it's dangerous work
And
to touch institutions.
and so much of what I do at Let My People Go is looking at this global injustice of human trafficking through the lens of vulnerability. And I've
Yes.
had people tell me, they say, well, you're not exactly like working with this group or that group, but you keep talking about the word vulnerability. You keep bringing it
Mhm.
up. It's like you're catching on. And the whole point
Yeah.
is, I believe that if we focus on our most vulnerable neighbor, and every community is different. Your most vulnerable neighbor in one
Yes.
community may be your undocumented neighbor. In another community, it
Mhm.
may be your neighbor experiencing homelessness. And in another community, it may be the single parent.
Yes.
Maybe people who are just trying to navigate they're just trying to navigate life, and they don't have the opportunities that you may have. They may not
Mhm.
have the networks that you have. When we realize that our most vulnerable neighbor is in our path, then what does it look like for us to care for them? And
Yes.
and we're not going to love someone if we don't know they exist. And so when we realize, okay, so this is who God's put in my path, how can I care for them? When we start doing that, we're going to end up doing the work of prevention, intervention, and aftercare all in
Yes.
one fell swoop, because we don't know
Yes.
who is vulnerable. We don't know who is trafficked. We don't know any of
Yeah.
that. But when we start actually having a real relationship with the people around us, and we choose to talk to people who may have different vulnerabilities than us, but
Mhm.
they have issues just like we do. Their issues may be
Yes.
different, and that's okay. When we do that, I think God shows up in a very real way, because I think God motivates vulnerable people like you and me to love other vulnerable people by becoming vulnerable for us. I think there's this stream of vulnerability that we see throughout Scripture. And what I love about what you talk about and how you are using your opportunity now to raise your voice, you're saying, look, God has called me and he has led me through a lot of things. And that's freeing me to see my neighbor. And that's freeing me to advocate for
Mhm.
my neighbor. And that's freeing me to care for my neighbor. And you are walking with and working with people who are persecuted, people who are hurting. And it appears that God has led you through unspeakable things. And there's a psalm that has always become a comfort to me, that we have gone through fire and water, but he has led us to a place of abundance. And for me, it's always carried this idea that adversity, we think it's ending us, when it's ultimately oftentimes renewing us.
Mhm. Resigning us.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Like, it's like the pain that we experience when we go to the gym or whatever. We're like, oh, this is the
Mhm.
worst. I don't ever want to go back. But it's changing us, it's growing us, it's helping us, it's healing us in some ways. And so one
And
of
it's
the things,
actually making us more effective for the gospel.
yes, yeah. And we're being conformed to the image of Christ through our sufferings.
Mhm.
And I think that requires the veil to be ripped off. And that hurts, because that exposes the false self.
Mm.
But the whole time, God is saying, but let that false self be ripped off. It's
I
okay.
really like your focus on helping the vulnerable in who are around us, and that it's all connected.
Hmm.
For a season, I was really focused on single moms because I was a
Yeah.
single mom and I had single moms living with me. And I can tell, now about 10 years out, there's certain single moms that lived with me that I don't know if all I had to offer at that time was, hey, you can live with me. I'll help take care of your kids so you can get educated, you can get a good job, and your kids could be in a safe environment. There are a few of them because of the environment they were in. I don't know if their children would have been trafficked. I don't know where they would have ended up. If my focus was not necessarily trafficking, it was to help a fellow single mom who came from a very different environment, refugee environment, and sometimes more violent environment, and just giving him a safe place to grow. And one of these single moms actually going to graduate with a really good degree. And she was just here a few nights ago. She lived with me for a while, and she brought two other single moms to me. And she's like, Naghmeh, tell her about Jesus. And she gave one of the single moms my book. And the next day, the mom was this woman who, has had children from different boyfriends and relationships, said, I prayed to God, and I said, God, what should I read? And maybe God, this is the way God's leading me to himself. And I don't know, it was interesting, but I wasn't necessarily, I was focused on the vulnerable around me, and it was a single moms at that time. But now 10 years out, I look back and I'm like, I don't know what they were saved from and what their children might have ended up in. But when we help the vulnerable, whatever that might be, my world is again more of single moms and refugees, but you are creating a better society and environment where you are fighting against even human trafficking and other stuff, because they're all connected. They're all connected.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, exploiters are looking for people who have vulnerabilities. They're like sharks in water. A shark, when it senses blood, it's sensing a vulnerability. I mean, that blood's coming from somewhere, right? And so it knows what to do when it follows the trail. And that's how exploiters seem to work. They leverage their power, their status, and they use it oftentimes to bolster their own vulnerabilities. And so you basically have people who are broken finding other people who are living with brokenness, and they're exploiting that. And I think when we flip the script and we say, what if my pain that I live with actually connected me to other people who were experiencing pain? Like, you talk about being a single mother, and now you're able to care for single mothers. I think that's such a beautiful principle, because no matter where you are, if you're a listener of the Mercy Cast and you're thinking, well, I'm just going through this thing and there's no way that I can help people, listen to Naghmeh's story. Listen to my story. Listen to those people who we talk to every week on this podcast. The thing that you think disqualifies you from helping people actually qualifies you. It actually connects you to people. And that's what it's all about. Is Henri Nouwen called it the idea of the wounded healer. And he basically said that we can minister to other people because everyone's wounded in some way. And our woundedness can connect us to other people. And as we depend on Christ who is wounded for us, we are free. Like, there's this beautiful thing that I wanted to touch on in these last couple of moments. But you mentioned this idea of coming as an immigrant to the United States. And I'm just reminded of the old covenant imperative where God tells his people, the Israelites, he says, you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Therefore now love the sojourner. Our love of our neighbor, of our immigrant neighbor, was grounded. It was grounded in redemption. And I think if we have been saved, if we have come to a saving knowledge of Christ, if we understand that he lived for us, died for us, and rose for us, and he has set us free, when we taste that, and we are seeking to continually taste that, but when the moment that we taste that and we realize he has done everything for us, so now we're free, well, what are we going to do? And I think one of those things is love the person in front of you. And I feel like that's been so much of your journey, has been, okay, like, I had this one ministry and I died to it. And now God is opening up a ministry that is fulfilling. It's different, but I'm depending on God for everything. And you're experiencing freedom. And I just think that's so beautiful.
Yeah. And one of my favorite accounts in the Bible is the woman at the well. And Jesus came to her very vulnerable. He had a need that he was not afraid to talk about and say, hey, can you give me some water? And I've noticed when I'm most vulnerable is actually when God uses it most for the gospel, where I say, to the refugees or to the single moms, I experienced abuse and this is my story. And, and coming from a place of brokenness and vulnerability is actually, I've noticed in the recent years, has made me even in God's amazing grace, even more effective for the gospel. And Jesus himself, he didn't approach the broken with this sense of like, let me tell you. It was more, he came vulnerable, like, hey, can you give me some water? I need water. And that started the dialogue. So coming from a place of vulnerability is really key in reaching the vulnerable that the abusers prey on and the mess we're seeing as society. We have the answer. We have the answer to all the violence and abuse that we see in the world. And that's to be vulnerable and to reach the vulnerable. But we have to come from a place of humility and vulnerability ourselves, And so I understand immigrants. I understand foreigners. Yes, I read in the Bible where it says you were once foreigners. And I'm like, oh, I know what that means.
Yeah.
It's so scary not knowing a language. And then coming from Tehran to Boise, Idaho, where it's like there was no foreigners and I was kind of one of the only ones. And at that time, 30 some years ago. So I've had to walk through some vulnerability myself to be able to connect to the vulnerable. And yeah, I think ultimately it's going back to that place of humility and being vulnerable. And that is actually what makes you effective for the gospel. And Jesus was an example of that.
And that ties into this idea of stripping away the false self, this humility, this vulnerability, this willingness to be found in who Jesus is for me rather than who I am for me. And
Jesus could have pretended he was like, I'm doing fine. I don't need water. But really being the reality of like, yep, I'm struggling.
I'm thirsty.
I'm thirsty. I'm not doing well right now. Like, I don't know, for ourselves, like with social media and this American culture, I think Middle East is more real. They can be like, I just having done ministry in the Middle East, people are just more honest about, they're not as connected by grace of God. They don't have the good internet we have. The government shuts down a lot of the websites. So there's more honesty. But I think with this culture, there's so much that you have to look strong. You have to look good because you want followers. You want people to listen to you. If they see there any weakness, if they see that Naghmeh also gets hungry and thirsty and has struggles with certain sins, like they're not going to want to follow you. And that's a lie. And that's something that has crept into Christianity where there's this false sense of self that we think we have to keep up this appearance so that we can be effective for the gospel, so that people could listen. And that's not true.
No, not at all. And it's the appearance of salvation. That's not what saves you. It's Christ for you. I mean, that's what it boils down to. And so, Naghmeh, for our listeners, how would you encourage them as they're wanting to kind of, one, see this false self, but two, live through it being stripped away so that they can find who they truly are?
I think you said it does get stripped away in trials and suffering, and all of us will go through it and have gone through it and will go through it again at some point. And so it's embracing that suffering. I think the persecuted church embraces it. It's embracing it and seeing the ending as a beginning. Okay, God, what is it you have here for me? How is it in the world's term I seem to have lost my platform? I was speaking in front of millions, and there was all these reports that, when I was in the media, close to 1 billion people were reached. And
wow.
I seem to have lost that effectiveness when I crumbled. But when that suffering and stripping happens, to actually go to God and be like, actually, what are you doing? And to really be open to how God's ways are opposite. When you think you're no longer effective because something about you has been exposed or you don't have those platforms anymore, to actually see it through God's lens and that actually you are being made effective for the gospel. Even more so than when I had close to 1 billion people listening on the news about stuff. His ways are so opposite than the way this world operates. And in a lot of ways, people that we think were so amazing for the gospel, that might not be the case when we go to heaven. It might be people that we didn't know that were effective for the gospel. So I would just say embrace. It's going to come. The storm's going to come like it has in your life. And the trials will come. Allow it to strip away your false sense and your old ways and your old thoughts, and submit to God to replace it with his ways and his thoughts. And And that brings so much peace and comfort when you're trying to hold on to the world's way of success and then looking at things that have crumbled and saying, oh no. But instead of looking at it that way, taking it to God and saying, this seems like an ending, God, but I know your ways are so different. And what is it that, and drawing close to God with that. So that's what I would say. Just really embrace. One thing I've learned from the persecuted church, they embrace suffering and they allow it to grow them, to sanctify them, to draw them close to Christ, and to learn what it means to be a ambassador and child of Christ in this a world that is constantly telling you that success and value and worth looks this way. And so you constantly have to, through brokenness and failures, you go to Christ, and suffering and persecution, you go to Christ, and he continuously has to redefine and grow you and change you and sanctify you. So I guess I would say embrace the suffering and also just seek God because it's not that just that the suffering is changing us. God is also giving us a heart for others through the suffering. It's not like, I'm being shaped into this amazing image of Christ. So what? Well, Christ reached the vulnerable. So the more you're refined and changed, the more you actually are, God is using that for being effective for the gospel. So that's what I would say. It's embrace it. God's doing something. Let it crumble. And there's freedom when it crumbles.
That is so beautiful. This idea of just allowing it to crumble, allowing it to strip away that false self so that we're no longer just staring at ourselves and being just introspective. But now that the false self it's being destroyed, now we're able to look outside of ourselves. We're able to see our neighbor. We're able to care for them.
Yes.
And we're able to realize that comfort doesn't necessarily mean we're more Christ-like. When we follow a cruciform Messiah, we will suffer.
Yes.
And things will be stripped away, but that will connect us, or we will grow in our relationship with God and others. And so, Naghmeh, thank you so much for being on the MercyCast. This conversation has been incredible. And so thank you.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate that perspective of vulnerability and mercy for others, no matter what journey we're in. Thank you.
If you are interested in more stories like this one, buy my book, Vulnerable: Rethinking Human Trafficking. Also, if you want bonus content, you can click on the link in the show notes to access our new and improved weekly bonus podcast, More Mercy, where I dive deeper into each episode. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave MercyCast a 5-star review. I want to hear from you. You can email me at info@mercycast.com. This podcast is brought to you by Let My People Go. To learn more about how you can love your most vulnerable neighbors through your own vulnerability, go to lmpg.org. Till next time, have mercy on yourselves and each other.